Welcome to the Outthinkers podcast. Plug into fascinating minds and breakthrough ideas that are transforming industries and the world. I'm your host, Kai Krippendorf, founder of Outthinker Network's global think tank comprised of corporate strategists and innovators that are shaping the future of business. If this describes you, please join us at outthinker.com. Now, let's dive into this week's episode.
Digital transformation, we've been kind of going through this for last 50, 60 years, right? With the dawn of information age, computing age, post-industrial revolution. But what has happened is that it used to we input data and we get data back, or we tell it to do some things and it kind of does it, right? So it was very passive. So metaphorically, you can say, okay, look, that was kind of like a tool. What is happening with AI is almost you have to look at it like, okay, it's no longer just a tool, it's our partner. But it's moving towards a point where it's almost like an entity, which is like a child, and we're the parent, because we're trying to grasp how it should think, how it should behave. Pretty soon what will happen, they will become the parent.
You just heard from Faisal Hoque, recognized as one of the world's leading management thinkers and technologists. He's an award-winning entrepreneur and innovator and a #1 Wall Street Journal bestselling author with close to 30 years of cross-industry success. Faisal is the founder of SHADOKA, NextChapter, along with a host of other companies, and serves as a transformation and innovation partner for CACI, an $8 billion company focused on U.S. national security. Along with his extensive successful career in technology and innovation, and with 10 previously best-selling books under his belt, his newest book, Transcend, Unlocking Humanity in the Age of AI, dives into the philosophical and far-reaching implications of the evolution of AI alongside humanity. I really enjoyed this conversation. Faisal and I discovered that we have a lot in common beyond our passion for technology and humanity and its history and future evolution. Like my mother, he was born in Bangladesh, then immigrated to the University of Illinois to study. Like me, he ended up in Southern Connecticut. In this discussion, we drew from insights from his latest book and dive into the intricacies of how AI has the potential to unlock innovation while also discussing the dangers, painting a sort of moral compass and blueprint for individuals and companies while navigating this new territory. In this episode, we discuss the metaphorical evolution of AI from being a technological tool to being a potential threat to becoming a strategic partner to maybe becoming something like a father or mother figure. Faisal's complementary open, OPEN, and care, CARE frameworks, which work in tandem to provide clear guidance for how to both adopt and harness AI. The pitfalls to watch out for and risks we may encounter as AI becomes even more integrated into society than it is today, as well as how to mitigate these and approach the future with proper guardrails in place. Ladies and gentlemen, Faisal Hoque.
Thank you so much for being here. It is great to finally have you on the podcast. I know we've been talking for several months about you being on, and it's great to finally have you with us. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to dive into Transcend and the evolution of humans and machines, and you drawing on your deep expertise and experience and seeing digital transformations, and this being another digital transformation, but maybe a much bigger one than at least I have seen in my life. But let's start off with the first two questions I ask all my guests. First, just to get us to know you a little bit more personally, could you complete the sentence for me? If you really know me, you know that.
That I'm a technologist, but I deeply care about humanity.
Where does that care of humanity stem from, do you think?
I think it grew over the years, because as you grow old and you explore and you find out how much commonality you have with each other and how all of our aspiration is the same aspiration and how we all struggle with similar kind of highs and lows and kind of survive through adversity and changes and try to take care of our family. I think it comes from there.
Yeah, we'll dive into that more. I think what's interesting, at least in my superficial thinking of it, and you've thought about it much more, is that in the past, it's been easier to look at technology as a tool for humans. And AI is maybe the first technology where the question arises of, are we for it or is it for us?
Yep, for sure. And I think it exposes humanity at a much bigger way than it ever has, because I think unlike any other technology, as you know, AI is a very active, if I can use that term, active technology versus a passive technology, right? So it's really could be today it's increasingly becoming our partner, but at some point it could actually supersede us because it's going to be far more intelligent than anything we have ever seen in our lifetime.
Yeah, which makes, as you talk about in your HBR piece, it's so important to start with your strategy and understand what you're after. So what's your definition of strategy?
Definition of strategy is that, how do you create not just the end goal, but how do you create a model that allows you to repeatedly go through a journey? And because, any growth or any transformation is not a destination. Just when you arrived, you kind of obsoleted yourself, right? So it is the process and the method that you put together that allows you to drive you from your purpose or core ethos or whatever you want to call it to constantly evolve, kind of be regenerative, right? If I can use that term. So that to me is strategy. Strategy is not just, okay, I want to do this. I want to, and I want to do, that's almost like a project plan or that I want to do a specific task. Task is not a strategy.
So, I mean, there's so much, you talk a lot, you write a lot about purpose. Strategy begins with purpose. You talk about the purpose maybe of humans or the characteristics of humans. I have a sense that you've thought a lot about what purpose is and why it's important. Can you share what your thoughts are?
Sure. Look, I think the purpose is, at the end, purpose is whatever you want it to be, right? Because it's driven by your authentic calling. May that be a individual or may that be a organization, and how do you craft that authentic calling into set of activity and set of ethos that generate some sort of a value? And this from your work, and I know this from my work as well. Every organization is vastly different. You look at one extreme, Patagonia, and you can look at Microsoft, you can look at Apple, and you can look at US DoD, right? So these are very different kind of purposes, and all of them has these basic fundamental things that we serve, right? And but the definition of serving is very different, right? And so purpose is very much individualistic, unique journey by each organization and obviously by each leader, because at the end of the day is the leader and their team, his or her team, that defines what that will be. So, but at the end of the day, I think all of them are trying to create a value, whatever that value is. And you could define value in 1,000 different ways, as you know.
And this is a little abstract question, I guess, but do you think that purpose it exists and you discover it, or does it not exist and you create it for an organization?
So I think, so it depends on where the organization is in their journey, right? So if you talk about a startup, right, which I know you work with a lot of startups, so did I, and we both built startups, so we know this, right? So sometimes that doesn't exist and you create from scratch. Sometimes, you reach a point and you have to reinvent yourself. So you have to redefine your purpose, right? And sometimes you say, look, time has changed because whatever reason, geopolitics, economy, technology, and you have to kind of reinvent yourself and kind of be with the time. So you have to define your purpose. But the most successful organizations don't necessarily lose their core value and core calling but what they want to do to stay relevant changes, right? That's why I say that strategy is a journey, not a destination, because you have to almost develop the core capability. How do you become a strategist? Not just, I have a strategy, but that strategy for sure would be obsolete within 24, 36 months timeframe.
I want to level this up in a moment to transcend and to kind of look from the organization to humanity, but just staying with the organization for a bit. What do you find, because you've worked with so many strategists, both in the public sector and the private sector, what do you find organizations get wrong when they think about strategy, or what's the biggest myth about strategy?
See, I think, whether it's innovation, strategy, transformation, people have this notion that, especially if you look at large organizations, right? I mean, they have this notion that it belongs in a handful of senior level people, and they never cultivate, many of these folks never cultivate that you have to make that part of your culture. Strategy got to be part of your culture. I know you write about this a lot and talk about it and advise your client with the same kind of a mindset. And so it just cannot be top down. It also have to be bottom up. So, in my practice, when I actually, whether it's for my company or for the organization that I'm working with, and I try to create a mechanism with portfolio structure whereby the idea and strategy is coming from bottom up as much as top down. And then you can kind of rack and stack to see which of those things actually make sense, rather than just saying, okay, well, we have the chief strategy officer, and the chief strategy officer drives it. To me, the chief strategy officer is almost like a curator and an enabler than the strategist for the company who's coming up with all the ideas, because no one person can possibly come up with all the ideas.
And I think that most of the strategy officers that we interact with, I think they would agree that what you hear them often say, if it becomes your strategy as the strategy officer, then you've lost it, because it needs to be the organization strategy. So let's level this up then to talk about humanity and technology. Maybe we can view humanity as an organization that has a purpose, has certain characteristics of which you lay out in your book. Just, if you don't mind, just kind of lay out your argument for Transcend.
Sure. Look, Transcend is my 10th book, and I've written a lot about, technology and organization and innovation, entrepreneurial mindset, that sort of a thing. So last year, or not last year, 2 years ago, when my last book came out, which was all about reinvention, and I said, I wanted to talk so much more about, that reinvention is going through, meaning it's reinvention of humanity. And I couldn't cover all that in one book. So we took on this book, we took on this journey with Transcend, and we kind of looked at it like 4 pillars. There's philosophy, there's humanity, and there's technology, and there's business, because they're all intertwined, right? So it comes from that context. So we started by saying, what is humanity? I mean, which part of humanity are we trying to protect? Because, as you know, humanity has a lot of good things, and humanity has some really ugly stuff, right? So which part of humanity are we trying to protect? And is all part of humanity worthwhile protecting, right? And where would AI will play a role? And every single person, every single organization, every single government entity has a role to play, because, what we do individually, simple thing as like what we post, right? You can look at it as a positive post, or we can create a really rile up the entire community with some crazy post. So, or what we consume, right? So all of this has an impact, and so we looked at it from that point of view, but we started this very philosophical conversation by asking, okay, how do we define humanity? So we kind of boiled it down, what I'm saying, me and my research team, which includes a couple of pretty deep philosophers along with technology and business people. And, we talked about that. You can probably boil it down to 2 things. One is freedom, because humanity is all about freedom of choice, very philosophical, right? Because it's authentic calling is a freedom, right? It's your authentic calling, not my authentic calling. It's your authentic calling. So it's freedom and love. Love in the sense that is love for, humanity itself. It could be love for your craft. It could be love for your calling, whatever the case may be. The definition of freedom, the combination of freedom and love makes what true humanity is. And you can use that for positive purposes, or you can use it for negative purposes, right? So the question is, when you throw a technology like AI, which for sure is going to be 1,000 times more smarter than anything we have ever seen, and we're really creating another species almost, right? It's a digital species that's going to be, which we have never seen, because, we've been kind of like the top of the food chain, and we're the smartest species. You're going to have a species that's going to be 1,000 times more smarter, because, you and I can talk all day long, but if we open up one of those large language model, it's got voice of thousands of people, right? So already it's more smarter. So when you add that on, what does it do? I mean, how does our humanity gets manipulated, maybe, transcended in a positive way, or enable us to be much better than what we are, or take us in a very dark place, right? Or we get completely controlled, right? So it comes from that philosophical point of view.
So you talk about that there is this underlying metaphor that we hold of when we look at technologies, especially with AI, right? And that we often aren't conscious of it, you know? So talk to us about what are the metaphors that people hold and what are the implications of those metaphors?
So it changed, right? Because, in the past, that's why I was saying that digital transformation, we've been kind of going through this for last 50, 60 years, right? From with the dawn of information age, computing age, post-industrial revolution. But what has happened is that it used to okay, we input data and we get data back, or we tell it to do some things and it kind of does it, right? So it was very passive. So metaphorically, you can say, okay, look, that was kind of like a tool. What is happening with AI is almost you have to look at it like, okay, it's no longer just a tool, it's our partner. But it's moving towards a point where it's almost like an entity, which is like a child, and we're the parent, because we're trying to craft how it should think, how it should behave. Pretty soon, what will happen? They will become the parent. And we're just like living, which is completely dependent on a set of being that no longer a human.
Fascinating. How do you think humans will react to that? Well, because we're outsourcing not to our child, we're outsourcing to this digital being, as you say. And I imagine some parents fight that. They want to be still in control, and some accept it, or some don't even know that they've accepted it. Well, how do you think humanity will react to that eventuality?
This is the $1 billion question, right? Because we don't know. So it depends on who you talk to, right? So if you listen to, you all, type of philosopher, who will say, we already lost it and it's going to be total doom and gloom, right? And if you talk to the people who has completely bought into AI, and, they'll say, wow, that's great because we will have so much time. I think it will depend what we do in next 3, 5, 10 years, in terms of how we use it, how we deploy it as a business model, how we regulate it or not regulate it, how government reacts to it. I don't want to, I'm going off tangent now. I mean, the notion of that regulation is a bad thing. It's not true. We have, regulation doesn't necessarily have to stop innovation. I'm all for innovation, as you know, right? So it's not stopping the innovation, but it's being responsible, right? So if you compare AI with other kind of positive and negative impact from technology, like you can look at nuclear energy as an example, or you can look at pharmaceutical technology or biomedicine as a technology for positive or negative. I mean, it's regulated for a reason, right? I mean, everybody should not have access to nuclear energy because you could create actually a nuclear arsenal, right? Same with the pharmaceutical. I mean, we have so much problem with, illegal drug addiction and whatnot. We could see the parallel with AI. I mean, it can be very addictive. I kind of catch myself from time to time because as I do research or as I try to craft something, I'm increasingly using different kind of AI tool, and also in the back, on the enterprise side, right? I mean, most of the conversation in the consumer side thus far, but it's increasingly going on the enterprise side. Where do you stop? How much is too much, right? So, and where the ethical boundary comes in, and where does the law comes in? I spent some time with some of our legislator because of my government work, talking about legislation, and there's a bipartisan agreement that there has to be much better kind of a model, than what it exists now. And there's the organization like NIST, the National Institute of System and Technology, that has these kind of a ethical framework and technological framework, but it needs to go much beyond that, right? Because Otherwise, we're going to lose it. Right? So you talk to the people who are the sending out alarm out there. That's where they come from, and I think that is the middle ground that we kind of have to follow.
Yeah, what I like about at least my understanding of your approach, and I'm going to get into this open care framework that you introduced. It is really kind of like a balance, right? There's, in Hinduism, you got Krishna, you've got creation, destruction, and you have the yin, you have the yang, and what I understand is we're saying, how can we harness AI for its good, but then how do we also in parallel manage and predict its risks? So could you talk to us a little bit about that? Because I thought that your open care framework was very tangible.
Thank you. Yeah. So this comes from doing the work and being a practitioner, right? Because if you look at a large organization or any organization, you have to constantly innovate. So you have to be radically optimist. How do you go and innovate, and how do you look at the art of possibilities and create different things? And by the way, I'm not a prescriber of that. Drop everything that you have adopted or learned, whether that's Core's 5-factor or whether it's Six Sigma, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. But you have to kind of all useful tool. You kind of have to construct your thinking in the sense, you have to be radically open to innovate, but you also have to care enough to protect the humanity. So the care for in an open stands for, you be open to opportunities and you assess where your opportunities are, find out the right partners, create a set of portfolios, et cetera, right? Care comes from a risk management, right? So the first letter of care is thinking about catastrophic scenarios that you could create for a particular initiative that you are taking.
You even verbized it, I think. Catastrophize, I think, I love that.
Catastrophize, exactly. And, it's the idea of that, look, you're trying to create, let's say you're building an HR system, which, by the way, Amazon did that in 2018, whereby they were using this tool, AI tool, to look at different kind of the candidates as a potential hire. And the software was, an algorithm was just pushing out people with particular schools and particular location and particular ethnic background, et cetera, and it didn't work because it was highly biased, because the people who developed a model came from their angle, right? That's actually very minor and a minuscule example of catastrophe. Now think about from a healthcare, right? Imagine, and I often talk about this because of my personal situation. I have a son who's a cancer survivor, and that's why actually all the proceeds of the book goes to cancer research. He's now 22. He was diagnosed at 18. And, he suffers from a particular cancer called multiple myeloma. It's a blood cancer. And usually people get that kind of cancer when you are in your 40s or 50s or 60s, actually mostly 50s and 60s. There are very rare cases when you are in that age group. So I was being a researcher and a technologist. I immediately dove into where can I find data set that's within his age group, and I couldn't find any, right? Psychologists said the same thing. Look, one of the difficulties is that we have all these data sets, and we now have a bunch of AI tools that does predictive modeling in terms of what should be the patient care model and what should be the diagnostics that we should be using to pinpoint, because cancer, as you may or may not know, is very individualistic. It's very specific, DNA type or age-centric kind of a disease. So you have to really customize, the patient care. And we couldn't come up with any because the data set doesn't exist. So imagine if we actually use the data set that are available, that applicable for 50s and 60s, it's not going to work.
Yeah, I could recommend some treatments with dire consequences. Yeah,
exactly. So that's where the catastrophize model comes in, because you have to think out of the box in terms of risk, not just being radical optimistic. You also have to be radical pessimistic and then balance it. We're talking about the balance, and then look at it like a middle ground. So it's not all in or all out. It's finding the best of where things are.
Yeah, because I find like every conversation that I have about future of technology, it becomes a self-reinforcing conversation where you think the future is either going to be Star Wars or Jetsons, or it's the dark or the light future, and then it just feeds back to your assumptions and then your choices. And so here, I think you've got both the dark and the light working in parallel. Yeah.
And the reality is, Kayan, that I mean, whether that's like the web technology, whether it's the ERP, or whether it's like CRM, they have been failing repeatedly because most of this implementation goes from the mindset of, well, here's a great technology, right? We got to use it, or we have to wholesale change everything, and in the process of doing that, you lose what your core purpose is. With AI, it's actually even more of a risk because of the fact that it can actively become your partner, in the sense that the future of the organization is going to be such that you're just not going to allocate work to human being. You're going to allocate work to these agents that are part of your organization, right? They will be your strategy partner. They will be your research partner. They, meaning these agents, right? The AI agents. They would be your warehouse worker bees that put stuff, which already does that's putting away your boxes.
Yes, love it. So many more questions, but we're reaching the top of our time. Let me read the last sentence of the book Transcend, which kind of points to where we could be going, and just ask you to unpack that for us. I think you already started doing that just now. If we approach AI with flexibility and humility, if we approach it within the spirit of service, if we detach from what harms and devote ourselves to what heals, well, to quote the English writer Rudyard Kipling, ours is the earth and everything that's in it. Just where could we be going, and what do you advise that someone keep in mind to create this human future?
Since you read that last sentence, and we talked about devote and the detach, which comes from very much of a Buddhist philosophy, and this middle, that's the middle of the road or middle mindset. We have to be very devoted to transcending the human potential, right? And we have to detach ourselves from what could cause harm and take away the best of humanity, right? I mean, humanity gave us lots of great things, poets, Rudyard Kipling to Miles Davis to Steve Jobs, right? And humanity also gave us lots of very dark characters. So how we stay devoted to enable more people like that, meaning more people like the Steve Jobs and Miles Davis of the world, is where we should focus on. So whether you're an individual who is influencing and coming up with things, or whether you're an organization that's serving a set of customer, or whether you're a government that's trying to increase the quality of life of your citizen with the infrastructure, that should be our devotion. And we should be detached from all the things we try to do on a daily basis that cause nothing but havoc.
And what I also got from your work is also, don't fool yourself to think that this is only the choice, influence of presidents and philosophers. It is, if you are a real estate agent and you are adopting, you're coming up with your plan on how you're influencing, the choices you're making are influencing our collective future. Amazing. So I know we only scratched the surface, but how can people continue to learn from you? Certainly they should get one of your 10 books. Transcend is the one that we're primarily talking about. You've got a great HBR article. You do great work. How can people continue to connect with you and learn from you?
Look, I mean, as I mentioned, the books are all for cancer proceeds. So please buy any one of them. You'll be helping some poor kid. So that's that. And also you can learn. You can buy the books in audio form and Kindle or ebook or hard copy on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, etc. My website Faisal Hoque has a plethora of information. I constantly keep pushing myself to write stuff. As you and I both know, we've written for Fast Company for many years. Simultaneously, you had your column and I had my column. So there's stuff like that. And I post stuff, on LinkedIn almost daily basis, some nugget of micro learning. So you don't need to buy anything or subscribe to anything to get those.
Well, thank you. Thank you for doing all of that, for thinking and working out there and capturing the insights for us in such tangible ways, Faisal. And thank you for taking time to sit with us and unpack it a little bit here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you to our guest, Faisal Hoque. Thank you to our producers, Karina Reyes and Zach Ness, and our editor and the rest of the team. If you like what you heard, please follow, download, and subscribe. I'm your host, Kyan Krippendorf. Thank you for listening. We'll catch you next time with another episode of Outthinkers.